with me a conference on the Guatemalan Genocide, she immediately was kind of saying yes. So she is coming from New York. She did the whole program with me. I'm really happy to have her here. And Victoria, please come up.
Okay. Because I actually wrote something down because I wanted to remember to thank everybody. And so thank you, Wolf. And I want to thank Wolf for inviting me to co-organize this conference, which is the first international conference on the Guatemalan Genocide. And I want to thank Wolf and Sandra, his wife first, Sandra, who ends up being a co-organizer as well, always helping with all of the details, right? And I mean, they go the extra mile for everyone. They've been going back and forth to the airport, picking people up to give a proper welcome to everyone. So on top of organizing the conference, always being so courteous and welcoming. And then, of course, enormous thanks to Stephen Smith and the Shoah Foundation for hosting this conference, and also for taking the initiative to include the Guatemalan Genocide in the archive here at the Shoah Foundation. Because we all know that inclusion of the Guatemalan Genocide in the archive at the Shoah Foundation makes it part of the historical record in a way that's absolutely distinct from it not being included here. So really huge, huge thanks, because it makes a difference for the present and the future. And then, of course, Shefali, who's back there running around, who all of us know because she has kept track of all the complicated logistics of bringing scholars here from all over the world. And lastly, of course, thank you to all of you participants who've cleared a week of your schedule at the beginning of the academic year to come here and participate in the conference, and for those of you who've spending your day with us as well. So I was thinking about saying something brief this morning, and I kept thinking of J.M. Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians. I don't know how many of you have read it, but there's a beautiful part where he says, "I know somewhat too much, and from this knowledge, once one has been infected, there seems to be no recovering." And I think that for the victims and survivors, and for those of us who have the privilege of accompanying them, we know that this knowledge must be shared, and the testimonies of survival must be preserved for the historical memory of Guatemala and for justice for the victims and survivors. This conference is really the most public of declarations that sí hubo genocidio in Guatemala. And so the conference is significant from the outset because it directly supports victims and survivors in their clamor for justice by contesting the ongoing propaganda campaigns of the genocidaires and their cronies in Guatemala who deny that the genocide took place. And importantly, we want to consider resistance to genocide here. How did people resist? What forms did resistance take? How does inclusion of stories of resistance enhance our ability to make these testimonies of survival part of the historical memory of Guatemala? And as we move through the amazing papers that you have all prepared, we have a unique opportunity to have a truly interdisciplinary conversation of depth and breadth about the Guatemalan Genocide, but also about our role as scholars. What does it mean to accompany genocide survivors? What are ethical obligations that we have with the stories that we are told? How do we keep the voices of the victims and the survivors front and center in our work? I'm really excited about this conference because Rosalina Tuyuk is our guide with her keynote address and participation. And this conference is also really special because it cuts across generations from our revered senior scholars, Marta Casaus and Ricardo Falla, who hopefully will be joining us tomorrow. And it includes junior scholars like Sergio Palencia, Miguel Zamora, Ana Maria Mendez, and Betsabe Martinez, who will carry on this work in the next generation of scholarship. So I think it's one of the really special elements of this conference. So we're delighted to have all of you here and look forward to a really productive and inspiring conference. As we move through these days together, I encourage you to think about the ways that we can take the knowledge that we share here beyond the walls of academia. How should we share it with our colleagues at universities in the United States, Canada, Spain, the UK, Mexico, and Guatemala? How do we make it accessible to victims and survivors in Guatemala? How can we put our collective knowledge and experience into ongoing service for justice in Guatemala? And how can we make this a permanent conversation? So we're really excited to have all of you here, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria. I wanted to add one element which is also on our agenda. It's to bring genocide studies and Latin American studies together, so which is, I think, very important. And as the director of the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, we are now trying to also establish research programs on Guatemala. So that's one of our next steps. Until now, we had a fellowship program, we have events, conferences like this, but the next step is doing really, let's say, more intensive research and trying to encourage especially research on resistance. So this is one of our agendas. I have also to do some thanks. So first of all, as I already said to Victoria, to help me and be a great spirit. Second of all, I want to thank the USC Latino Alumni Association, who was very instrumental in making this happen, because we were trying to get a grant for the conference and were kind of declined. And maybe I should reveal this. One of the commentators actually said there was no genocide. So that's why we actually lost this grant. So even more so important is what we are doing here right now. And I'm really grateful to the Latino Alumni Association of USC to helping us out, and also to the Department of International Relations of USC, who also is a co-sponsor of this conference. And not so much, yeah, maybe you give it. And not so much with money, but with an incredible facility. The Villa Aurora in Pacific Palisades is also kind of a co-sponsor. You will all see on Wednesday why we picked this, why I tried to get in there. It's a wonderful location to kind of have some kind of closure of the conference, which is on such a dark topic, with a look over the Bay of Santa Monica and Malibu. And then I wanted to thank everybody for coming, and especially the staff of the Center for Advanced Genocide Research. Shefali was already mentioned, and I mention her again because really this was incredible work. But also, not to forget Martha here. Martha, who, and Emily over there. So they were working, tirelessly for the last months, and really put a lot of effort, extra effort in this, and also kind of other work had to kind of left on the desk just to really get everything coming together here, so that we will have a very fruitful conference. So thanks to everybody, and now I'm handing over to Steve Smith, the Executive Director of the USC Shoah Foundation. Stephen.
Good morning, bienvenida. It's great to have you here with us at USC and at the USC Shoah Foundation. I have the distinct honor of being able to introduce our first speaker this morning. And in doing so, to share with you why the work with Fredy Peccerelli and the USC Shoah Foundation is so fundamental to why we are here today. A couple of years ago, Wolf and Sandra Gruner and Karen Youngblood, who is the head of the Shoah Foundation Collection Department, went to Guatemala. Our purpose was to learn. Nothing more than that. No program, no plans for conferences, no decisions about collections, but simply because we knew that in order to be able to think more deeply about what the consequences of that genocide were, it was important that we stood there with those who experienced it. Our guide, our teacher, our mentor was Fredy Peccerelli, who took us with him in his vans into the hills, to the exhumations, to the inhumations, took us to visit with Rosalina and to see the beautiful work that she does with the women who survived sexual violence, and to learn from her. And over those few days, week or two, however long we were there, our understanding developed. We came back to USC, and the question really was, so what do we do with this? Whoops, I think I'm doing Freddie's presentation now. My mistake. Oh, where do I go? Oh, really? How did that happen? Anyway, you get the idea. You'll be seeing this in a minute. I'll keep my hands away. What we felt was that the contribution that we should be making as a major research university in the United States of America was to stimulate a research program, and we felt most importantly was to align that around one of the key research topics of the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, which Wolf directs, which is on the issue of resistance to genocide. And so, in fact, it was the CAGR, the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, that has led this effort. And as that's happened, the need for more documentation, and for archival material, therefore testimony, and engaging therefore more deeply with the FAFG to collect that testimony and join our work together so that we can create a pipeline for more data, so that we can research more deeply the human consequences and therefore the resistance to genocide during and after became very apparent. And so therefore we were able to start collecting together. That in turn then provided material for us to bring into our education programming, and now just this week we've launched the first 3 education activities on our platform Eyewitness for schools on the Guatemalan Genocide in Spanish. And for those of you that were there yesterday, teaming up with a major documentary film company to make a documentary, Finding Oscar, which premiered last week in Telluride and will be making the circuit. And if you didn't see it last night, keep an eye out in theaters in LA in the fall, to make that movie so that we could tell a wider audience. So our work together here at the University of Southern California is just getting going, and thank you for being here because you are a part of that. This is not the end of a process. This is the beginning of our commitment to continuing to research the genocide in Guatemala, to make clear that it is known that it was a genocide and is a genocide, and that we continue to commit ourselves to deeper research in that area. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the papers you're going to present. I don't know what they're going to say right now, but I know they're going to be important in this journey, and thank you for committing to that. Fredy Peccerelli is a scientist. He's a forensic scientist. But I have come to know him as a humanitarian and a teacher. And I'm not going to say any more than that because you're going to have the pleasure and privilege of hearing from him right now. But just to say, I consider what Fredy does sacred work. But it also enables the research that we have to do to make the case and to understand more deeply and to go through this period of unfolding and transition and confrontation with that past. And for that, I want to thank you, Fredy Peccerelli, for not just being here for today, for everything you do. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Fredy Peccerelli.
Well, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Wolf. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you to USC and the Shoah Foundation for opening its doors, its arms, its souls to us. We only met very few years ago, and we came here because of Oscar, and Scott and I wanted to see the work up close. And so Scott somehow managed to get us a meeting with Stephen. I'm sure we would have got one if we tried, but we didn't. Went through the back door and we got this meeting, and we tried to convince Stephen that the work in Guatemala was important. It didn't take much convincing. We had one meeting, and after that, he decided that they were going to come to Guatemala. And that trip has made all the difference in the world. And Stephen said one thing that sticks with me all the time, and he said, after all the places we've worked and all the testimony we've heard, we've never seen such raw emotions like the ones we've seen in Guatemala. And that made all the difference in the world, because that statement drives what we're now doing with the interviews. And what I come to you today for is to present to you the work of the FAFG. As you know, we're a forensic organization. And through the years, 24 years now, our work has been around the families. And this is constant for us. We do not work unless the families ask us to work, unless the families are there for us to work, unless the families tell us where the graves are, unless the families tell us their stories, help us. And basically that has allowed us to become part of what it means to be in that space. And in those spaces, unfortunately, we find these graves. And these are graves that are located within communities. Most of these, and the work that we started in 1992, was focused on exhuming the graves of the massacres. And we did that. We're still doing that. However, as of 2004, we also began to focus on searching for the disappeared. And it's important. I want you to really distinguish the difference. It has taken us decades. But the disappeared are people that were individually targeted, like in Argentina and like in Chile. We don't know where they are. Whereas the victims of massacres, we know where they are. A lot of them were buried by their own families. A lot of those crimes were, unfortunately, had hundreds, sometimes thousands of witnesses, and the communities themselves had to deal with them and had to bury them and live with them. However, with these families are invisible. These families haven't spoken to anyone. Sometimes within their own family, they don't speak of what happened because the individual that was taken because they were determined by someone to be an enemy of the state. And to look for them meant risking the survivors. And so people like Rosalina and Aurelena, whom you saw yesterday, are really our inspiration because they're the ones that go beyond that fear. They're the ones that are not willing to be invisible and are the ones that have begun the search. The process for us, the forensic process, has been the same, which is we interview family members, try to understand the relationship of the people that are missing or that have been killed to the living. So we can take DNA samples now, which is the part that isn't the same. And that's how we found Oscar. But let me tell you a little bit about what we have done in forensics and how it now joins with the Visual History Archive through a case. This is Chell, and Victoria knows it well. And in Chell, on April of 1982, the military came in. Most of the men had left to work, and there was only the elderly, the women, and the children. They were separated, as it's unfortunately customary, and the women were separated from the men, from the elderly men, and the children, including the young women, were separated, and sexual assault, rape, was part of the whole system. After some time, the bloodshed began, and people were taken to this bridge. This bridge the picture we have is of the bridge being reconstructed, but there was an older bridge here, wooden. It had rails, and people were taken to this bridge in groups of 3 or 4. There was a fire next to the bridge. The fire was said to be for the small children, and they were thrown into the fire alive. The older people were chopped with machetes and then thrown over the bridge. They would fall on these boulders and then roll down the river. And when we got there, this is the story. This was what families told us. There was 95 to 100 people killed. However, as soon as we began this investigation, we could only come up with 68 names. And that's part of it. People always ask us, how come the numbers don't always match up? Well, there are reasons. Sometimes because an entire family is killed and nobody gives information about them. Nobody reports them. Not because they don't remember them, but because, well, maybe it's our mistake. We only ask, do you have a family member? But we have to think in a broader scale. So in the end, what happened is that the bodies were thrown into the river. And these men, and that's me down there with those men, they showed us that they were watching from the mountainside as this killing was happening and the bodies were being thrown into the river. And as they started to float away, they ran down river and cut a tree to dam the bodies, to stop the bodies from floating away. and they recovered 60 bodies. You could see behind them, there's a waterfall. You can't really see the bridge there, but there's two falls. The fall from the bridge to the boat to the rocks was about 5 meters, and then there's a second fall. So the bodies, we expected the bodies to have not only gunshot wounds and machete wounds, but also blunt force trauma from the fall. These men, incredible, courageous men, I don't know how they did it, because I walked down to this spot. It was about 500 meters vertical. They carried 50 bodies up the mountain during 5 or 6 days on their backs, decomposing, bodies floating in water, their loved ones. I don't know how they did it. They took most of the bodies up to this mountaintop where we found 4 or 5 of the graves. And as you can see, the families, the community is part of the entire process. The other bodies, 10 of them, were taken to crypts, to above ground crypts. Now this is important because the bodies in the graves were in bad shape, but the bodies in the crypts were in amazing preservation stage. In other words, we could see a lot of what happened through these bodies. And this is Furflo, who is Fernando Flores, one of our original investigator that would talk to the families. He passed away. When we found this picture, I was like, oh my God, Furflo. And this is how we worked with the family, with the community, and establishing trust. You might say, oh my God, you're exposing children to this. Children have grown up with this. Children were victims in this. Children are entitled to see their own history come out of the ground. And so one of the important things is, I remember grave number 1, we started finding a lot of little pieces of thread on both sides of the head. And we realized that they were earrings. So this was the grave of the women. They were all buried in grave 1. Remember, they were buried by the men. So they told us that they buried a lot of the women in one of the graves. And although we don't determine sex by clothing, to have those earrings there gave us an initial clue that this was the grave of the women. Eventually, we took the bodies back. We had help from the guy, there's 2 guys in the background with white hair. All the way in the background is forensic odontologist Rodney Crow. And in the foreground is medical examiner Nisam Pirwani. He's a medical examiner of Tarrant County in Fort Worth, Texas. And he is an expert in trauma. And he came down to contribute and help us understand these very complex cases because of the combination of trauma that we were seeing. So what you can see here is on your left, that's a vertebrae from your neck. And the red little arrow is signaling cut wounds. And this told us of slashing wounds that came from the front as they cut people's throats. The one you see on your right is a mandible, and it's the posterior part of the mandible. And what you see there is cut wounds because as they were trying to decapitate people, they were screaming. So you open your mouth, and the machete hits you right at the angle of the mandible. Now this is important because this corroborates what people were telling us. And that's what we do. We try to understand if what people are telling us is represented in the remains. There was children. There was, in total of the 68 people that were reported to us, 2 of them were fetuses. So there was 2 pregnant women. And this was important. There were comminuted, complex fractures caused by a fall. Or as the Nisam Pirwani would say, this fracture could have only caused by a car traveling at a high speed and hits you directly with the bumper in the head, or somebody jumping off a building. How is Chell? I was like, well, no buildings, no cars, but they threw him off a bridge. That's it. They threw him off a bridge, their heads hit the boulders and cracked. This one I was telling Erica, and I'm sorry I haven't thanked Erica, but Erica's here with me. Erica is my assistant who's been helping me with all these presentations and make sense of this. And she's Canadian, but she works in Guatemala, and she helps us keep going. So thank you, Erica. And I was telling Erica that, as we were preparing for this presentation, I saw this slide, and you might not see much when you look at it, but it's really important because it tells us that people their hands were not tied, at least this person, and these are defense wounds. The arrows are pointing to very sharp cut wounds. So this is a left hand, and this is somebody doing this as they're being hacked with a machete, which is extremely important to understand what happened in Chell. However, although we had the forensic evidence and we had the testimonial evidence through antemortem interviews, it wasn't really till very recently that I felt like I understood Chell even more. And that's because of these interviews. So we interviewed, I'm only going to show you a couple of clips, very small clips. But this first one is a clip of a survivor, of a girl that was thrown into the river at the time, and that we couldn't interview because they didn't make available to us. She was too young. We didn't try. But going back to these communities now is exponentially increasing our understanding of what happened.
Cuando lleguemos en la puente, con el puente, ya está el sangre, está mucha sangre está en el puente, y dice mi mamá conmigo, no vas a parar la sangre, mija, porque no sirve, dice mi mamá. Después y ahí está el soldado allí, y mirando a mi mamá, y ahí está mi mamá, me tira el soldado por el río. Yo lo digo que no lo siente que le tiran en el río, y ser más bajito lo se siente. Y el sol una vez entra a mi cara. Mami, ¿dónde estoy? Sacar en el río, digo yo con mi mamá. Pero no está mi mamá, está muerta, está muerta, está muerta, está muerta. Todo muerto está.
En 1981 empezaron la masacre de gente de aquí. A las 6 de la mañana entraron los ejércitos y a juntar la gente. Muchos ancianos mataron. Mataron ancianos hombres y ancianas mujeres, y mataron las mujeres embarazadas, y mataron los niños. Mi papá no hay. No está mi papá y mi mamá. Cuando yo lo fui a ver en el puente, pues me puso una gran tristeza porque mi papá no tiene el hilito, y mi mamá, mis hermanos no tienen el hilito, sino que yo lo vi como fue la macheteazos, pescuezos a su cabeza, mi papá, mi mamá. Ese todavía no me sale ese dolor, digamos.
And I don't know if you can see it from those two clips, but it gives you a different sense of understanding. And it goes back to what Stephen said, the sense of raw emotion. We felt like we could not carry with this responsibility anymore. For 24 years, we've been listening to this. We've been writing it down. We've been seeing the bones. And we've decided that it's no longer our responsibility only, but it's also your responsibility. So we, together with the families, have decided, and together with Shoah, decided to make these interviews available. And it all started with this visit to USC, and then with the trip to Guatemala. But it has grown into a very complex, growing relationship that has advantages for both organizations and for scholars and for the families and for us as an organization. And I couldn't be happier, and I come to USC now and I feel at home. The whole team, I see everybody in the team, it's amazing. And I thank you for that. And I thank each one of you that is participating in this for your role in making sure that these testimonies are seen by the world, by everyone that has doubted that these things happen in Guatemala, by the new generations who don't know about what happened in Guatemala. and by Guatemalans themselves. We started with, Karen Youngblood and Sandra came to Guatemala. We decided we would start small. The interviews are not just about taking the interviews. I mean, we're taking the interviews, but the Shoah Foundation here is doing the indexing and the keywording and uploading and preparing educational programs. And I'm sure Sandra will speak to that later, and maybe Wolf. Our part initially now is to take the interviews, to take that trust that families have given us for many years and show them this option. And so the first thing that happened was that they came down and they told us, okay, we need you, well, before they came down, they sent us a list of equipment. And I was very surprised. I was like, wait a second, you mean I'm not just gonna whip out my iPhone and just like set it next to us and just conduct the same antemortem interview? What do you mean, lights and cameras and cinematographers? What's... And then they said, no, well, if we're going to do this, we have to do it right. It has to be done in a way that the sound is good, that the framing is right, that the video is right. We want to preserve this forever, I want to say. And so part of the training was to understand not only that this was a different type of interview, which was very hard for us, because we had carved out a space. And in our procedures, we always interview people all the time, hundreds and hundreds of them. So we figured we would just pop a camera up and interview everyone. Doesn't work that way. These are different types of interviews. And the first thing that we had to do was train our investigators, retrain our investigators to understand that for the first time, we were not only going to be asking about what happened, which is what we always did. What happened? Who's the victim? What did you see? But we were going to begin to ask, what's your first memory? How was growing up in your town? What did you eat? And initially it was a bit difficult for us to understand, but quickly we learned that this was important. You see here the tall guy, that's Fredy Peccerelli. He's the first person he used to be our IT guy. He's still our IT guy, now he's our camera person, number one camera person. And then you have Luis and Hugo, who are now additions. I don't think, Sandra, you haven't met them, but now we have three guys taking, we only have 2 sets of equipment, but they rotate. So we have 2 teams in the field all the time. That's all of them. Initially we called them the Shoah team, but then we realized we're not Shoah, right? So we call them, so we started saying, now we've created a name for the FAFG, Archivo de Historias Visuales, right? And these are them, these are the guys. They don't stop doing what they're supposed to do. They're still taking DNA samples. They're still doing genealogies. They're still taking antemortem interviews. But now they're also taking these life histories. So far, we have recorded 217 life histories. And when I say so far is as of February 26, 2015, a year and a half ago. When I saw this date, I was like, that's got to be wrong. It's got to be 2014. 2014, we had barely met. So in a year and a half, we've been able to do this. And the reason we've done it this way is because I feel that we have a very small window of opportunity. Funding is not there anymore for Guatemala. Interest is not there. Politics change all the time. The cases in court are posing new threats. So we had to do as many as possible. But as Victoria will tell you, this is the way we've always seen things in Guatemala. We have to do as much as we can now, because if not, we might lose the opportunity. So we began, and so far we've interviewed 92 men, 125 women, in 11 departments. Now, there is a little difference between where we interview somebody and where the crime occurred. So this is the location of where the crimes occurred. Right? Not so much where we've interviewed people, because ideally we want to interview people in their homes or in a place that they're comfortable with, but that doesn't always happen, right? As you can see, Quiche, the overwhelming majority. Now, the idea is to continue this process and to represent the entire country. But the reality of it is that it depends really on the families and on the survivors and the witnesses. Who wants to talk to us? Are they comfortable with doing this? Do they understand that this is going to be made public? And when they agree to do that, that's when we decide that we can go ahead. Obviously here you can see that almost the overwhelming majority of the interviews are to a Mayan population, Quiche, the highest, then Achi, then Ixil, then Cachiquel. That's no surprise. And those of you who are, well, all of you that are scholars, you will understand the reasons behind this, right? And this is the same way that the massacres occurred as well. So it just happens to be that this pattern of who's represented has a lot to do with who the victims were, who was targeted. And no surprise there, but it's always good to see it reflected in a very small sample. The other thing is that initially, when we started with Sandra and Karen, they spoke about a pre-interview. And we're like, pre-interview, we don't have time. We know these people. You know, we're not gonna drive 8 hours and walk 5 we're not gonna do that. Well, guess what? We've learned that it's extremely important to do a pre-interview. So now we have to do them because it's necessary to the process. We see that with the pre-interview process, the interviews are better. They flow better. The people we're interviewing remember more. They talk more. There's a better relationship between the person asking and the person telling. There's also a better understanding of our investigators. And they know where to go with the questions. And the idea, they're actually facilitators of a conversation of a person's life. But now this has become extremely important to the process. Like I told you, the part that's new for us is what happened before. And it's actually, even if maybe it's not, it won't be the most interesting to scholars and to others, but for me, what happened, the life before, is probably my favorite. Because a lot of these people I know, and although I've seen them walking around and smiling and leading normal lives, I've never seen them smile in an interview or remember good things. And so this part, for me, I think is important. It makes people comfortable. It ties them in with who they are, and people come out of this empowered because for the first time, the Truth Commission, the Church Commission, the prosecutors, no one has ever asked them about themselves. They've always asked them about what happened. This is asking them about who they are.
A mí me recordaban anteriormente que jugamos a veces de chibol, lo que le dicen bolicín, y a veces jugamos de trompo también. Entonces salimos a ir a bañarse en el río, a jugar con los otros patojos, así.
Antes tratábamos de construir nuestros juguetes, porque no lo había. Hay unas ruedas que tratábamos de hacer con palos y nos poníamos a jugar, juntábamos fuego, jugábamos trastecitos.
Jugaba así con mis amigos porque ya habían varios patojos ya, y yo jugaba con mis hermanitos también.
Hacemos una cosa, muñequita, va a cargar a menete o a jugar tierra, o dice que va a poner comal en el suelo, dice que a tortear.
And then, of course, later, eventually, we will get to the part of what happened during the conflict. The other thing that has happened as we continue to go ahead with this is that different themes, different crimes keep popping up. We've tried to put them in specific, or to label them. Sometimes it's hard because you have a person that was a survivor of a massacre that was later raped and then later submitted to torture, and then later their loved one was disappeared. So it's difficult to fit people in these boxes, but we have of the interviews, 4 of them are people that were in exile, 57 of sexual violence, 30 people that were detained and tortured, 12 members of someone who was disappeared in the family, 2 that were enslaved, 57 that were displaced, internally displaced, 16 that witnessed executions of 1 to 4 people, and 39 that were witnesses of massacres or 5 victims or more. And this is just to give you an idea of what comprises the 217 interviews right now. And I just want to show you a couple of clips of what families are telling us, besides the people in Chell, other people, what they're telling us and what they went through.
A pie hay un camino que sale de ahí a Pachay cuando topamos con los soldados que estaban ahí escondidos. Y como sabíamos todo lo que hacían, que a todos los mataban, no nos paramos, sino que nos volvimos para atrás. Más adelante, donde nos huimos, había un sembrado de milpa. Llegamos allí, les dije yo a los niños pues que se acostaran en esa cuneta. Y había el zacate, estaba grande, estaba por aquí el zacate. Entonces yo empecé a doblar el zacate sobre ellos y después me metí yo debajo. Terminando de hacer eso, llega un helicóptero a dar vueltas sobre nosotros y a dar vueltas. Pero como estábamos escondidos bajo el zacate, no nos vio. Y de allí bajó el helicóptero, ahí cerca donde mataron a mi esposa. ¿Qué fue a traer ahí o a dejar saber? Pero llegó el helicóptero.
Cuando llegamos al carretera empezaron a disparar. ¿Qué tiro? Empezaron a sacar. Entonces, con eso me dio miedo. Yo ya no sentí. Yo corrí. Ya cargaba a mi chiquita. Corrí, crucé la carretera. Cuando me fui embarcado, iba al disparo. ¿Qué pasó? ¿Ve? Me caí yo, pasó el disparo. ¡Pah! ¡Pah! El disparo. Pura estrella, las luces. ¿Qué pasó? Y yo me caí sobre una corona de espina. Es una cicatriz que tengo aquí. Al rato, como 20 minutos, cuando escuché los gritaderos, los niños, empezaron a gritar, como le hacen a un marrano, lo maten. Se terminó sus voces. Dios mío, dije yo ya solo oraba, pidiendo, pero ya no se puede hacer nada. Cuando llegó la hora, ya no se puede hacer. Solo cruzamos el carretero, encontramos una cabecita, estaba tirada abajo del alambre. Y fueron más ellos, ay Dios mío, aquí están los niños, ¿qué te pasó? Dijeron. Ay, tus hijos, dijeron, ya estoy, ya. Se perdieron mis hijos. Ay, yo los fui a encontrar muertos. Todavía los moví. Como uno se llama José Dolores, ay Chepe, ¿qué te pasó? ¿Qué te pasó? Le dije yo, así le de olla, lo tienen aquí, ¿ves? Aquí les dieron la arma, que arma, cuchillo, no sé qué usar. Hoy aquí les dieron.
We've also taken 57 interviews of sexual violence. Since we only have a little time, we've only picked very few clips, but I encourage you that if you're researching that, this will be made available, hopefully in the near future.
Me violaron, ¿sí? Me violaron, sacó mis hijas atrás, me violaron, sí. Eso sí, Dios, ya no. Mi suegra se fue a esconder con otro cuarto porque podía asustar. Ya no vas a gritar, si gritas, tener mucho cuidado, te vas a gritar, déjame, te vas a quedar una vez aquí, una vez muerto, me dejan con...
Una noche estuvieron ahí, y mi mamá. Pues ahí lo más triste para mí, porque ahí es donde se abusaron de él. No lo puedo soportar. Imagínense, son 30 años, más de 30 años. Pero no se me olvida, pues, lo que le hicieron a ella.
this whole process has created now even more trust between the families and our investigators, and more of a sense of responsibility. So like I told you, we want to make sure that three things happen. One is that these interviews are shared, that they're communicated, that they're used. Two, that they are preserved, hopefully forever, so that people could see how individuals, families, communities, society, and the whole country was affected. And three, so you can use them to teach, to educate people about what happened. And hopefully, I still have to say, it's difficult to say it, but hopefully it won't happen again. And as when I went to the Holocaust Museum, it says, never again. And unfortunately, the real story has been again and again and again. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and that it shouldn't be one of the objectives to show people why this should not be happening again and again everywhere. In Syria today, Mexico today. So one of the things that we've done is we've tried to focus initially on the bigger cases, just because they were done a long time ago, and it's helping us reconnect with the communities in a way, like I said, that we hadn't experienced before. So Rio Negro and the survivors, the few survivors from the 5 different massacres there, those are people we're interviewing. The people from Chell that you saw some of the interviews. The people from Dos Eres that the movie last night, the documentary last night was based on. Estrella Polar, Pambach, the men of Pambach as well, that you saw a scene or two in yesterday's film. Their voices are now included in this process. The women of San Andres Acabaja, with the help of Rosalina. I was telling Rosalina about this, and she said, you have to come to San Andres Acabaja. I've been working with 250 women that were raped. And after 10 years of talking with them, I think they're ready. Because when we were there, Victoria was there. I remember we worked in something in 1997, and we asked as part of the interviews if people had been raped, and very few people said they had. Well, it happens to be now that we know that most of them were. And now they are coming forward. And Rosalina has helped us understand that this is also part of, it's sort of a graduation as part of a mental health process. Before they wouldn't tell anyone, now they're telling the entire world.
Estos son mis historiales que ya he contado, que como he vivido y sufrido. Entonces, de que ojalá que más adelante, en el futuro y de lo pasado, que los públicos que me van a ver, que yo soy una persona colaborador y defensor de mi pueblo chilense.
Ojalá que esa entrevista no quede solo en Guatemala, sino que vaya ampliando a nivel mundial. Porque lo que conté, esa no es una historia solo así por así, sino que yo viví en carne propia.
Y gracias por esta oportunidad, ¿verdad?, de compartir mi vida. Y son muchas cosas, ¿verdad?, que han pasado, pero sí me siento, tal vez no el 100% ahora satisfecha, pero yo creo que hay mucho que hacer todavía.
Y lejun tich nanka nok lejun historias en schochbes bisabal nekem bixta inches que ashach también le qatat le qanan o la bomab nka waqtach porque oshom bis oqih spin ip shya chwein pa wenuk aslamal weshon qashach es que chaqmak shbeqih ishugab saqrik.
So as you can see, that third part, that's sort of the third part of the interviews, is people tell us about the now and what they want and what they hope. So this is all new to us, and even newer, because our process still is the forensic process. What we do is search, excavate, analyze, interview, take DNA samples, compare them, and hopefully identify people. That's what we've always done. And that's what we try to continue to do. And that's the process. However, now it's beginning to meet with this new life history process, because this is, I want to show you an interview of a person that we interviewed before we found her husband, and then after we found the husband. And this is the first person that we've interviewed that has gone through that in real time in the last couple of months. And I just thought it was very fitting that you can see the potential that this has.
Nunca pensábamos que él ya no iba a regresar. Salió de la casa a las 8:20. Solo me dijo cuando se vino. Pero me había comentado 15 días antes. Mira, me dijo, allá en la puerta del trabajo, de la ferretería, me dijo, llega un hombre y ahí pasa todo el día viéndome que yo subo y bajo a dejar mercaderías. Me dijo. Hasta que fue ese 13 de enero que él desapareció. Una señora lo vio ahí, que llegó un carro y lo empujó. Y él se cayó de la cicla. Y vienen los hombres, se bajaron, dice que en el carro, y lo agarraron a él, lo subieron en el carro. Y estaban subiendo la bicicleta cuando apareció su otro hermano a ver qué le había pasado a él, a mi esposo, ¿va? Pero que sí que también al hermano lo agarraron, lo subieron en el carro. Lo subieron y subieron las dos bicicletas, se los llevaron. Se los llevaron a saber a dónde. Hasta hoy fecha no se sabe nada.
Este trabajo que hizo la Fundación, que hicieron las dos fundaciones, la Antropología Forense y Fundación, para mí es muy valioso. Y yo cabalmente vengo aquí a darle las gracias a todos ustedes que se hicieron como mis amigos, mis hermanos, y les agradezco mucho a ustedes que también me tomaron en cuenta como el equipo de trabajo con ustedes. Esta noticia que me dieron, sí, me impactó mucho, me puse a llorar, no sé qué hallaba qué hacer, yo casi gritaba de la alegría, porque ya estoy feliz, ya estoy contento de que ya mi esposo fue identificado, pero es por la fuerza, la lucha de ustedes que también aguantaron hambre, aguantaron sol, frío, en aquellas montañas que se siente un frío, que se siente, yo digo, un frío por los espíritus de los que están muertos ahí. Ustedes lo aguantaron todo. Entonces que Dios les bendiga, que Dios les protege. Yo sé que ustedes siguen trabajando con esas excavaciones, que Dios los acompañe. Y yo siempre ando con oraciones detrás de ustedes en este trabajo que están haciendo.
So thank you very much.